Alright guys, in this video I'm going to share some footage from the San Diego iOS developer meetup that I've been hosting for the past year or so. So back in 2023 it went dormant, I think because one of the organizers moved to Idaho or something. So anyways, it went dormant, but then an email went around saying, hey, does anybody want to take over this meetup group? And I'm like, I'll do it. So I took it over and I've done about 10 or 11 meetups so far. Our next meetup is going to be on Tuesday, and we're going to talk about how to train a custom AI model to recognize different objects. So, for example, you could have it recognize different exotic fruits that normally these things can't name because nobody knows what they are. So, you could also, I think one of the demos I'll end up giving is detecting whether a piece of fruit is ripe or not. Okay, so stuff like that, but you could use it for all sorts of different things, street signs, different objects of all sorts. So that's next Tuesday. If you're in the San Diego area, definitely come by. Now, the footage I share in this video is actually from the November meetup. And what we talked about was, is Apple actually behind in AI? So that's kind of been the narrative since Apple delayed Siri. Everybody's saying, oh man, Apple's falling behind, and OpenAI and Google Gemini, they're going to, blow by Apple, and everything's a doomsday thing. Now, one of the things that most people don't realize is that Apple actually released an LLM in the Foundations model framework. Okay, and they were going to use this as the foundation for the new Siri, but they already use it for things like writing tools. So when you want to proofread an email or have it be rewritten to be more concise, okay, it uses this on-device LLM. And as a developer, we actually have access to it. Now, in the interviews that Apple did, where people were wondering if they're falling behind in AI, they said many times in the interview, we're not doing a chatbot, we're not doing a chatbot, we're not doing a chatbot. Okay, but you could actually, if you want to, you could create a chatbot with this on-device LLM. And so just to prove to people that they're not, that far behind, sure, Siri got delayed, but one of the other things to talk about is that Siri is doing something totally different. Okay, all these other LLMs are doing real world knowledge, right? Where you're asking things about the outside world. But with Siri, it's supposed to be directing and controlling your data on your device. So you're asking it information about your device, and you're commanding things on your phone and your HomeKit stuff and all that. So it's a totally different domain, and there's really nobody that's doing that well. Okay. Now, if you wanted to make a little chatbot with that LLM, what I did do is show in this presentation how you can. You can make a little chatbot wrapper real quick. I just made a little janky one, and you could talk to it as if it's one of these other LLMs. And it actually is surprisingly good. It has a lot of real world knowledge. So that LLM is used again in the writing tools. As a developer, you have access to it. You just create a language session, language model session, I think is what it's called. And you can chat with this thing as if it's, ChatGPT or Gemini or whatever. Now, one of the things that's interesting about Apple is that they've always had this focus on privacy, and it's your data. Okay. And they don't, scrape all your data like with Google, they might do with Gmail. So they'll read through your emails and stuff like that to train stuff or to give you better ads or whatever. Okay, but Apple has always had a strict stance on it's your data, and they want to protect your data, have privacy. So that is actually, I think, a good thing, and I'm excited about that. Now, it does disadvantage them when it comes to training these huge language models. Okay, but one of the things I argue in the presentation is that these other language models, sort of the rumors that are going around, let's say, are that they have been used on stolen data, especially OpenAI. Google, maybe not so much. And I say, Google has a big history of, having to obey copyright, whether it's with YouTube and different music and stuff like that. So they have sort of more institutional knowledge about obeying copyright. But with OpenAI in particular, there's a lot of rumors that it's trained on sort of stolen data. And assuming that's true, then it's not really sustainable. Okay, especially when you consider that like 10 years ago, when I had a programming question, I'd go to Stack Overflow. Now I go to ChatGPT. Okay, but the Stack Overflow used to be monetized, it would make money, and it would create this environment where people would share code. But with ChatGPT, if they're just scraping that data from Stack Overflow, let's say, how is that data being monetized? Okay, it isn't. And so it's not sustainable because there's no incentive for people to continually input new data because the LLMs are only as smart as the data they're trained on. And so I think there's a huge opportunity, whether it's with the BSV blockchain or something like it, where you can actually give royalties and reward people for the content that they contribute to an LLM. So there's a huge opportunity with that. And even Apple could step in and start like watermarking content because the reality is all the content that you create is done, on a company like Apple, whether it's Apple or an Android phone or a Windows or whatever. So there's these companies where you're actually creating the data. And what you could do if there was good frameworks for Bitcoin SV is maybe you could start watermarking or hashing these things and keeping track of where the provenance of the data is coming from and give people royalties. Because sure, you can train the LLMs on all the data, but what about the new data that's going to come out in 2026 and 2027 and the new frameworks and the new code? Okay, we want to continue to incentivizing people to share um, what's going to become the input for those LLMs. So there is a huge opportunity, I think, with blockchain to start tracing the source of that information. Now, when you have an LLM, it becomes tricky because it's a lot slower if it's going to trace back sort of the source of its data. So one of the things I've heard is that they like do watermarks, and then they'll be able to, they don't have to retrace their step, but they can see like what the output, it has these little watermarks in the tokens that they can see, okay, this is most likely the source of this information. You could give them a royalty. You don't have to sacrifice on speed because it's not going backwards, it's just taking the data going forwards, but then you see the watermarks in the output. So I don't know the whole details on that, but there is a huge opportunity. I know there's been a lot of speakers at the BSV conferences talking about this, where you could have AI built in a sustainable way with micropayments and royalties to the creators that contribute the data. So the reality is, though, is BSV needs a lot of development, and especially in terms of like for an Apple developer like me, they need to have a Swift library. Right now, they have a TypeScript library that's helpful, but I don't use TypeScript, so I'd love it if they had it in Swift. So if you are a Swift developer, especially like a low level, you love building APIs and stuff, definitely reach out to me and I'll put you in contact with some of my friends at BSV, and they might actually be able to pay you to create one of these libraries or at least translate the TypeScript library into Swift. Okay, and that would open up a whole new world of opportunities because you could get in touch if you had a Swift library with things like the secure enclave, so you can store keys on the device. You could get in touch with the near field communication frameworks that are all written in Swift. So there's so many different things that would be so beneficial if we had a Swift library for BSV. Okay, but the reality is I'm not a super low level programmer like that, and I'm not the best person for that job. Okay, now if you are somebody like that, definitely reach out to me and I'll get you in touch with the some of my friends at BSV, and we'll see if that we can make something happen with that. All right. Okay, but until then, I'm going to go ahead and roll the footage from this last meetup, and I hope to see you to one in the future. Or if you're out of town, just you can tune in here, and I'll see you in another video. Um, but yeah, so they built this framework basically, and Siri wasn't it wasn't performing like they wanted it to, and so they never actually released the new Siri, but they released all the other Apple Intelligence stuff that builds off of this model. And so it's there, and you can create this language session that I just showed you in code right here. And so, so it's there and it's ready, but they haven't done it yet, and we'll get into why. Yeah, you're welcome. Let me just adjust this a little bit higher. It's just filming me, so you guys are not going to be on it. If you want to be on it at the end, maybe I'll pass around that mic. We always have about maybe, you know, on average, 3 to 5 people show up. So I figured I might as well film it so that people can tune in once they, you know, once they just find the group on the internet. All right, so the topic is Apple behind in AI? And the first thing we have to talk about is that AI is more than LLMs. And there's all these different frameworks that they provide. So you have the Vision framework, which is super cool, and it's what powers like the Apple Vision Pro when you click your fingers together. But the Apple Vision framework, so you have all this different stuff on the left here. So you could do a hand tracking, you could do object tracking, you could do face and body tracking, which is super cool. So if you're doing like a workout app or a dance app or something, you could see what pose people are in. So this is all AI, and they use it in Apple Vision Pro and others, and it's all available to us. So certainly Apple isn't behind in this respect, right? They have a ton of different stuff. So here's their whole stack, right? So the Vision framework I just showed you, they have translation, natural language, all this stuff. But this one in the top left, the foundations model framework, this is where they actually they let you get access to it, the LLM, right, that they built. So it's like, you know, ChatGPT, whatever they're, how do they say it? 5.0 or, you know, 4.0. It's like, it's a language model, it's a release of it, and you have access to it. Here's Ross.
Hey.
Hey, hey.
Wow.
Yeah, we got a good turnout. Our other record was the Apple Intelligence. So I think it's a good topic. But anyway, so they give you access to this LLM, and they have all this stuff, right? So they're definitely not behind in all these other areas, but what people tend to do is they simplify Apple's AI as just being Siri. Okay, but AI, you know, goes way beyond just LLMs. They use it in all parts of the app, you know, ecosystem and operating system and stuff like that.
That link on the previous page says active access to that right there.
Yeah, this is the Vision framework. I'll show it to you right here, so you can take a picture. But this gives you hand tracking. You can do scan barcodes. You can scan all sorts of different stuff. Text, like they've been building this for a while. It's super, super rich, rich stuff. And so this is all AI, but you know, nobody uses it on their phone. And, like they use it in different types of fitness apps and stuff like that. And when you scan barcodes, but nobody thinks of it as AI because people simplify AI as being LLMs or being Siri, right? But it's a lot more than that. So let me show you this interview where the Wall Street Journal was asking the head of software, you know, don't you want to build a model like ChatGPT and all these other people? And we'll see his response.
Looking ahead, does Apple want to be the company making some of these models? Would you like to have that capability, some of the capabilities that OpenAI has in their models or Anthropic, central to Apple, living in Apple's models?
Oh, I mean, we already are. In fact, we published a paper again this year describing our latest releases of both on-device models and our private cloud compute model. Both have undergone significant architectural and enhancements. Our PCC, private cloud compute model, is much larger and more powerful and is GPT 4.0 class in many regards. So this is something absolutely that's what we've been doing.
Okay.
All right. And then to prove it, let's go ahead and take a look at this, right? So they actually have this app, or I built this little app. They don't give you a chatbot. And if you watch the rest of that interview, welcome. Yep. If you watch the rest of the interview, he talks about how we're not building a chatbot, right? We're not doing a chatbot. We're laying this foundation for all this stuff, but we're not doing a chatbot. But everybody equates AI as being a chatbot. Now, the funny thing is that in this foundations model framework, you can build a chatbot to chat with it, right? And so this is super janky. I didn't like put there's a lot of bugs in it, but you could actually, this is me interfacing with their LLM. So in the same way you interface with ChatGPT or any of these other models, you can do it, right? So we can, and it has a surprising lot of world data. So I asked it, the capital of California. We can say, what's the population of the United States? If you guys can think of any questions you want to test it with, let me know. So 331 million, and it does it in all this text. So this was the foundation that Siri was supposed to use, and they ended up, they wanted to make it more reliable, because the reality is that Siri traffics in your data, right? So it's changing your notes or reading your notes. You're like, what was that, code I wrote in whatever, and it's going to go into your notes and find it. And so you don't want something that's trafficking in your data to be unreliable. And so they had built Siri, it used all this stuff, it had this LLM as a foundation, but it wasn't reliable enough, and so they didn't ship it. And this is it. So if you guys want to test, with any question, think of one, let me know and we'll ask it. But it actually has a surprising amount of real world knowledge. So they just didn't get around to releasing it because they're doing a totally separate thing, which is making it control your device. Whereas all the other chatbots, you're asking it about, stuff about the world. You're not necessarily wanting it to control your phone. So for the people that just joined, first of all, we said that Apple does a lot more of, AI than just LLMs. They have the Vision framework, which powers Apple Vision Pro, and all sorts of other augmented reality stuff. They have the speech, the translation, all this other stuff. And then the LLM access that they give you is in this foundation models framework, which is their new thing. And that was supposed to be the foundation of the new Siri, but again, they pulled it because they didn't want it to be buggy for people's personal data. So LLMs are dependent on good data, right? So if you have garbage in, garbage out, it's not going to work. And so, different companies have different methods of training it. And so a good metaphor here is all the data is like your library. Like we're in a library right now. You could think of different universities have all this different library. And then the training method to build the LLM is sort of like the librarian, like the IQ of the librarian, let's say. And so you're limited on the data that you have. So right here where it says data sets the ceiling, right? So if you have the smartest librarian that knows nothing and you put them in a small library, maybe with incomplete books and stuff like that, your LLM isn't going to be that great. So it's dependent on data. Now, if you look at the competitors that are doing LLMs, they have a ton of data, like Google, right? Let's do Google's first. So Google's mission statement has been to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful, right? So they're taking all of this stuff. They have Google Books. They have all this stuff from the world, which is a huge library, and now they could train an LLM on that, right? And then Sam Altman said in this interview, which I thought was interesting, let's play it, how he views it.
Someone said something early on in ChatGPT when that really has stuck with me, which is one person at a lunch table said something like, we're trying to train this to be like a human. Like we're trying to learn like a human does, read these books and whatever. And then another person said, no, we're really like training this to be like the collective of all of humanity. We're reading everything. We're trying to learn everything. We're trying to see all these perspectives. And if we do our job right, all of humanity good, bad, the very diverse set of perspectives, some things that we'll feel really good about, some things that we'll feel bad about. That's all in there. Like, this is learning the kind of collective experience, knowledge, learnings of humanity. Now, the base model gets trained that way, but
all right. So can you start to see the difference between the philosophy of somebody like Google, OpenAI, and then Apple, right? Because what they're doing is trying to get all this information about the world, where Apple is really building devices that is trafficking in your data, right? Siri takes your data. So you say, what was the name of that person I met at the meeting on November, whatever? And it's going to look at your calendar, it's going to look at your notes, it's going to look at your contacts, and it's going to find that person and give you the name. So that's trafficking in your data. It's not trafficking in the outside world and the internet and, books and all that kind of stuff. So it's like a totally different approach. Now, the cool thing is that LLM is in there, and it shows that Apple can produce an LLM that's as good as, these other ones. They just have a different focus, which is to be your data versus the world's data. It's kind of like an intranet versus an internet. And the other thing that's interesting is Apple has this thing about, it's your data. It's all about privacy. They're not known for, like, Gmail will go through your emails and train it. Apple doesn't do that kind of stuff. So they have this very strong thing about it's your data. So the other thing I wanted to show you is that a lot of these, you guys know this guy, Vitali? He's from YouTube. He's a prankster. Well, he does a lot of steroids to get big, and he was arrested in the Philippines. And then this is him after a couple of weeks of not having access to his steroids, and he's shrunk dramatically. And so the funny thing is that a lot of these models, like ChatGPT and stuff, they've been trained on data that's actually copyrighted, but it hasn't been used with access permission and stuff like that. It's interesting because Google with Gemini, Google has a lot of history of having to obey copyright. So with YouTube, they have the content thing and they take it out, right? But if you had to actually enforce copyright with something like ChatGPT or the others, this would be what it was like, right? Right now it's that because it's taking all the copyrighted material, but if you took that away, it would shrink dramatically. So we have to be realistic about, about what access, what data people have access to, and how are people being compensated for it? Because if you read through a bunch of copyrighted books, are you allowed to just use that? Because people aren't, or let's take Stack Overflow, right? So in the early days of my programming, I'd use Stack Overflow for everything. But now I use, ChatGPT or one of the others. And so I don't go to Stack Overflow. And so that content isn't being monetized, but a lot of the code for my answers is coming from that site. So then if they're not getting paid, then how does the information keep on coming? Does that make sense? Like, if we're not incentivizing anybody to create the input for this library that the LLM is trained on, then how is it going to continue that way? And so I think a lot of these models, we're seeing what's possible. Okay, we're all roided up and we're seeing what's possible because we're using a lot of data that's not copyrighted or paid for and stuff like that. But if we take that away, then short term we're going to get small, but then long term, as you actually incentivize people to create content and pay for it, then it creates this feedback loop where people are actually making a career off of providing code or providing whatever. And I think another thing with like Swift Assist. So how many of you people know about Swift Assist that was promised? Yeah, so we have a few. So basically, before Xcode integrated the this Apple Intelligence thing on the left, so they promised that they were going to have this Swift Assist, which was going to be a way of helping you write the code. but then they pulled it at the last minute and they basically let you put in ChatGPT or Anthropic or whatever model you want in here on the left, and instead it reads your code. And I think part of the reason is because, again, Apple has always been, it's your code, it's your data, and it doesn't have this huge library of stuff to train on. And so I think that's what held it back, and it probably wasn't reliable enough. They didn't have enough training data, and so they're using these other ones. Yeah.
Is that limited to like large models, Anthropic and other like LLMs, or we have the ability to bring in something that's a custom model?
You could actually bring in your own if you want to. So you could do a locally hosted one right here. You guys are, is that helpful for you?
Yeah, very. Thank you.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm doing it a different way, and it's not as easy. This is going to be a lot easier.
Yeah, it'll be cool. Yeah, so they have all these options. They have Claude in here, and so they kind of just they put in this this option where you could use whatever LLM you want for your coding.
Is that on device? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So when I'm typing and it'll like write an entire function automatically, is it using one of those?
That's autocomplete, and they were promising Swift Assist, which would do even more than autocomplete. This should be.
But you know what I mean. It's not just simple autocomplete. I mean, it'll anticipate like the whole function I'm about to write.
Yeah, it'll. Here, I'll show you. All right, so I'm gonna say, give me a summary of this app. Okay, so right now it's reading all the files as part of this project, and it's giving me a summary right here. So this Apple is a chatbot, essentially, a chat interface that allows users to interact. And it figured this out from my code, right? Which is super cool, especially if you inherit like a big code base from somebody else and you're like, oh, maybe your boss says, can you make this change? Or like in the olden days, that would be like your worst nightmare. You're like, okay, I have to go through spaghetti code and figure out somebody else's code. But here you have an LLM that can, tell you what's going on. So, and it could also write code, okay? So let's say, here's the little chatbot I built. And again, this is using the on-device LLM, so it's fun to quiz it. So if you guys have any questions to ask it, let me know and I'll put them in. But let's say I want to turn this plus button purple, okay? Can you turn the plus button where you add a PDF purple instead of blue? So let's see if it can do this. Okay, so it's going into the conversation view. I zoom in so it's easier for people to see. All right, so it looks like it's done. Oh, there it is. Okay, so it just found the foreground color in there. It's purple. And so let me rebuild the app. Okay, and there it's purple. Pretty sweet, right? Didn't have to dig into the files. But the thing that gets tricky is that if you rely too much on it without knowing what's going on in the project, then it just, you're making changes and you don't know how it's changing. And then at the end of the day, it just starts crashing. You're like, I don't even know where to fix it. So you got to be disciplined. You can't just let it do everything. But it'll show you in the file. So I could click here and then it'll show it right here. And it's kind of interesting. They built this thing that's separate from the Git repository, but it tracks all the history of changes. So,
I was going to ask, version control and regression with that.
Yeah, I wish, well, I don't know the details. Maybe it's better they did it this way, but it's like a separate version control than Git. But you can still use Git, but it has this history right here, which is it's almost like, why do they not just have it all the same? But maybe it's because not everybody uses Git or something. I don't know. How do I get out of here? But yeah, so it's super cool. So this is the intelligence feature, and at first they promised that they were going to have it be Swift Assist. It's going to be super private. And that was really appealing to me because it's like, oh, I don't want my code to be sucked up by ChatGPT, and then this thing I spent years developing, suddenly somebody can say, I want it to look like that app, and boom, here's your version of it. So I'm a little bit hesitant. That's why it wasn't turned on to use it. But you could also control down here. I use it for sample apps and stuff, but what you can do is, like, let's say, oh, here, this is what I'm looking for. So these binoculars down here. So this is where you can turn off its access to your files. So right now, if I hover, it should say automatically search project for context. So it can go through all your files and it can see all the code you've written. And like I said, I didn't say in the conversation view, turn the button purple. I just said, turn the blue button purple, and it figured it out because it had access to all my files. So you have to read deep into the privacy policy. The cool thing is if you don't sign into your account, it's all anonymized. But as soon as you sign into your account, then it's associated with you, and who knows what really happens with that stuff. But it's super useful. And I'm sure what happens at Apple, because you were asking, can you use your own? I'm sure internally they probably have their own thing that they're providing, and that's why you can have a locally hosted LLM for code writing. So the short answer is they're not behind in AI, but as far as Siri is concerned, they haven't released the new Siri, and it sucks. And everybody associates AI with Siri, and so they dropped the ball on that. But.
So another question. So Siri can hand off to GPT, for example, as you're going through. Is there a way for GPT to go back to Siri to give instruction or to give information back to Siri?
I don't think so, but I read on Mac Rumors that so Apple was going to have a Gemini. They're going to use Gemini for the next version of Siri. And, I actually think it's probably better than OpenAI because right now OpenAI is all on debt. It's all venture capital, and it might not actually be there. And if you look at Gemini, I mean, I'm sure they'll survive in some form. But if you look at Gemini, Apple or Google can continue to fund it without venture capital because they have their other businesses, they have search and this kind of stuff, which is probably slowly dying. But they can use that money to keep their prices lower than OpenAI for the long term. And I also think they probably have stronger, kind of institutional knowledge about how to handle copyright and stuff like that with YouTube and all this stuff. That OpenAI, I think they'll probably get bit in the butt later because, if you've, I don't know how much.
There's a benefit to them as far as anti-competitive by letting Google bring Gemini into the back end. That kind of detutes what they have when Google says, well, you're not sharing your platform, or it's anti-competitive.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. We'll see if it gets busted for anti-competitive stuff. Let me try and find this Mac Rumors article. Yeah, sure. Oh, wow. It's the top story. It's a brand new story, too. Google Gemini. Okay, but that's not where it plugs into Siri. Okay, but anyways, they just released Gemini 3. So let's say Siri Gemini. New version of Siri to lean on Google Gemini. All right, so Apple is planning to still roll out a revamped version of Siri around March of next year. The release should be accompanied by the release of a new smart home display product with speaker, base, and wall-mounted options like the HomePods, but with a screen, I guess. The new version of Siri will apparently lean on Google's Gemini and include an AI-powered web search feature. There's no guarantee users will embrace it or that it can undo the years of damage to the Siri brand. I also saw that Elon Musk he was offering to use XAI for Siri today in some sort of tweet. So, but I don't understand exactly, why they need to use Gemini. But it looks like they're going to use it in their private cloud compute. So do you guys understand what they built? So basically, with small requests, they do it all on device. But then if you ask something that's really complicated, maybe it takes a lot of different information, it'll actually put it up to Apple servers, but it does it in a way where it's all still using, essentially it's the same chip. I think it might be the same chips in the phone, but they have these huge amounts of them in the servers. And so it's all done privately. It's just, they just use that for more power. So it looks like maybe the LLM model that we're using here for this guy right here, okay, maybe that it's going to be somehow Google's model and theirs a hybrid together or something. Because again, what we talked about in the presentation is that Apple is they're not a search company. They don't collect a bunch of data. They don't have like the, where was it? Right? So all these other, like Google, right? Organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. That is not Apple's mission. They don't do any of that, you know? So how are you going to have an LLM that knows everything about the world? And if you don't collect that, well, you partner with Google.
Have you seen the new Gemini interface? Watch it by accident. You press the @ symbol on there, and you log in. It kind of sort of agentic, like you were describing with Apple's system.
Awesome.
So it's going to try to tap into all your Google account stuff.
Okay, cool.
And help you search it, look at it, and there's YouTube Music and Spotify, I think, and a few different, whatever you can count on, it'll let you sign in and authorize over to that account. It's linked to your Google account, which is all access to Gemini.
Very cool. I haven't used it. I'll check it out. But we did a presentation on the foundation model framework that I mentioned briefly here. That this is where you get access to the LLM, the on-device LLM. But in there, you could also have it, instead of just giving you back text, you could actually have it give you back objects for your code. So if you have, the example they gave was like a hiking trail, and if you had, you wanted it to return like the length of the trail, the elevation or whatever, you could say, these are the parameters I want, and it'll give you back an object. So it'll answer with an object that just ties right into your code instead of answering with text. It's pretty cool. Let me try and, I probably have that presentation, but yeah, it's a lot more than just a chatbot. And again, they say in this interview several times, we're not building a chatbot. We're not building a chatbot. And so that's why people think they're behind. But the funny thing is that if you wanted to, you could build a chatbot using their foundation model. But it's not going to be as good as the others. So.
I also think for Apple's point of view, it's better for them to have a product that makes people more connected with the device itself.
Exactly. Yeah.
Just having open chatbot that other competitors can do, because you want to have something that fix problems or make things even easier or faster within the device itself.
Exactly. Yeah, it's all about controlling your device. And that's one of the things, maybe I could find it in here, but he says, nobody's doing this really well. Because nobody's trying to command your phone, right? They're doing chatbots with information about the world, but this is something different. It's your personal assistant that you're saying, add this to my calendar or move that schedule back. Who is that person I met at the meeting last month? And it's going to go through your contacts. It's going to have all this stuff. And so if it sucks and you say something and it changes all this data of yours, like that's going to be a terrible experience. Then let's finish with this because it's perfectly relevant. Everybody, all right, let's see here. And Apple definitely does not follow this anymore, but they followed it in this one case, right? All right, so how do you build a culture? Is what he's saying.
Much harder to do. But it's a company of 10,000 people. How do you permeate the message throughout all the employees? What do you say to them?
Well, you permeate it by example, ultimately. And in other words, when something's not quite good enough, do you stop and make it better, or do you just ship it? You know, and everybody watches to see how the senior management makes those decisions. And what we've tried to do is stop and make it great before we ship it. When we have problems, stop and fix them. And by example, you can say anything you want, but everybody watches very carefully when you're in a difficult situation, what decisions you make, what values you have.
I mean, there are so many Japanese companies who are now.
So anyways, that's how you have a high culture of good standards and good products. But again, they've dropped the ball so many times. Apple Music was the first like disaster. I was like, this sucks. Compared to back in the day, you had the cover flow, like the Apple app used to, or the music app used to be so cool. Now it kind of still sucks, dude. Apple Maps was a disaster when it was released. But I like Apple Maps now. Yeah, I like Apple Maps. But it was released. It was not great before it was released. Ever since, they kind of just throw it against the wall and see what sticks. Usually version 2 or 3 of whatever they release is good. But version 1 nowadays, like the Apple Vision Pro, the first operating system sucks. The version 2 is like good, but there's so many bugs in the first one, so. Because I had the first iPhone, and I remember that day, it was so cool, and everything was so polished, and everybody was like, oh, it was so cool. But anyways. All right, you guys, thanks for coming. Thank you. Yep.